The following article appeared in Rolling Stone magazine, March 1983. Did Lee Harvey Oswald drop acid? New evidence suggests he was among soldiers given LSD in a CIA test program. The article was written by Martin A. Lee, Robert Ranftel, and Jeff Cohen. It was a hot summer day in New Orleans in 1963. A young man walked into the office of Edward Gillen, an assistant district attorney. Gillen offered the visitor a seat, but the young man chose instead to stand across the desk from him. He had a question about a drug, one that Gillen had never heard of before. This was no ordinary drug, Gillen was told. This drug would affect the social and economic history of the world for the next 200 years. The young man wanted to try the drug, and that was what brought him to Gillen. He wanted to know if the drug was legal, and if he could bring it into the country from somewhere else. It was important, he insisted, speaking for the better part of an hour on the wonders of this new chemical. Gillen just sat there, somewhat bewildered, trying to assimilate the story. Who was this guy? What was this drug that would transform the world? Any drug that could produce the results this person spoke of, Gillen reasoned, would have to be illegal. He also concluded that his visitor was probably a bit crazy. Gillen suggested that the young man visit the New Orleans chemist, the police authority on such matters, and strongly urged that he consult his personal physician as well before doing anything further. The visitor left, and Gillen never heard from him again. A few months later, over the weekend of November 22nd, 1963, to be precise, Gillen came to recall that odd encounter. President John F. Kennedy was slain on Friday. A new president was sworn in 2 hours later. And on Sunday, the accused assassin was himself shot down in a Dallas jail. As these incredible events rumbled into one another, Gillen thought of the conversation he had had that summer. As the details and descriptions of the life of the accused assassin became known, Gillen realized that the visitor he had received that afternoon in New Orleans was none other than Lee Harvey Oswald. In July 1979, the final report of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, the first full congressional investigation of the murder of President Kennedy, was published. The committee concluded that Kennedy was probably killed as a result of a conspiracy, although it stopped short of identifying the conspirators who may have been behind Oswald. The HSCA contended that Oswald fired the fatal shots at the president, but that he was accompanied by a second gunman. Thus, Oswald, a loser all his life, was finally relieved of sole blame. It had been a long road for Oswald from infancy to infamy, and now, at last, the government admits he may not have traveled it alone. Since the assassination, the mind of Lee Harvey Oswald has been open turf for historians, psychologists, and conspiracy theorists to muck about it, speculating on every conceivable motive and intrigue that might explain what happened. He may have played in that might explain what role he may have played in the death of the president. Described as assassin or patsy, lone nut or conspirator, misguided Marxist or CIA operative, Oswald has never been pegged as a doper. Gillen called the FBI the day Oswald was killed and told them he believed Oswald had been using unusual drugs, but the FBI seemed uninterested and the drug lead was never pursued. Had the Warren Commission decided to investigate the psychedelic connection, the logical place to begin would have been to ask, did Oswald turn on, and if so, where did he get his drugs? As it turns out, there is good reason to believe that Oswald was taking psychedelics at a time when the CIA was handing them out. The temptation to connect these two facts demands a look at two relationships, that between the CIA and drugs, and between Oswald and the CIA. The CIA first began experimenting with LSD during Project Artichoke, an extensive behavior control effort launched in 1951. Project Artichoke was aimed primarily at developing unorthodox methods of interrogation, including narco-hypnosis and a combination of various chemicals that, when properly administered, would catapult a person into a semi-conscious limbo that the agency called the Twilight Zone. After several years, however, the CIA had not yet found a method of interrogation that would guarantee a recalcitrant subject would disclose sensitive information. This prompted the agency to step up its search for a truth drug. It was during this search that CIA scientists first got their hands on LSD. Early reports looked promising. One document indicated that experimentally, LSD had been in interrogation and has proven remarkably successful. Another memo stated unequivocally that acid was better adapted than known drugs to both interrogation of prisoners and use among troops and civilians. Or so they thought. Later experiments showed that LSD was not a reliable speech-inducing agent. Accurate information could not always be obtained from a person who was high on acid, because the drug caused marked anxiety and loss of contact with the reality. But this did not faze the CIA, which was fascinated by LSD. If it did not live up to its potential as a truth drug, Artichoke scientists would simply adapt the interrogation procedure to suit the far-out possibilities of this unique chemical. LSD led to totally new methods of interrogation. Often a subject was given a surreptitious dose of acid, and once the effects took hold, he was told that unless he spilled the beans, he would be kept in a tripped-out state indefinitely. This tactic proved successful. LSD interrogations of enemy spies were in full gear by the mid-1950s and continued through the early 1960s. Acid proved useful for other CIA purposes as well. In order to discredit socialist or left-leaning politicians in foreign countries, the agency would slip a hit to unwitting targets so they would become incoherent and embarrass themselves at public appearances. The CIA has never ever, in parentheses, the CIA has denied ever using dirty tricks of this sort in domestic politics. The CIA's acid experimentation took on more comprehensive and extravagant dimensions under the super-secret MKUltra program. Consisting of 149 different projects, MKUltra was one of the most sensitive, covert operations ever undertaken by U.S. intelligence. In addition to hallucinogenic drugs, MKUltra comprised every conceivable mind control technique: hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, ESP, lobotomy, subliminal projection, sleep teaching, and thousands of different drugs. The CIA employed hundreds of academics and behavioral experts to help crack the secret code of the human mind in order to control it. A multi-million-dollar effort, this program literally spanned the globe. One location in particular deserves careful observation. Atsugi, Japan, was the site of the CIA's headquarters in the Far East. A particularly strategic location in those years that bridged Korea and Vietnam. While the CIA's presence at the Atsugi Naval Air Base has long been known, U-2 spy flights over Russia and China took off from Atsugi. An important facet of its activities has only just recently come to light. Since the early 1950s, Atsugi served as one of two overseas field stations where the CIA conducted extensive LSD testing. A 1953 memo stated that LSD was being stored at the Manila and Atsugi CIA stations, and that its use in special interrogations in Europe was being considered. So, there's a side note while we're here. Edward Lansdale, who was portrayed in Oliver Stone's JFK. He was a major general involved in the CIA, major general with the Air Force. He was stationed in the Philippines in the early 50s. He rebuilt the intelligence service of the Philippine Army, and he helped them develop psychological operations and so on and so forth. So most likely he had something to do with LSD and its effects on the many prisoners over there in the Philippines at that time. He happened to be in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Continuing. In addition to interrogation sessions, the drug was also employed experimentally on military personnel. These tests continued throughout the Cold War decade and into the early 1960s. One Marine Corps veteran who participated in the experiments at Atsugi recounted how two CIA officials gave him a variety of drugs and apparently tried to recruit him for CIA service. This guy says, "We just want to see how you'll react. If you're going to be a spy, don't you want to be informed about every mind-altering drug there is?" They wanted to find out how well you could stand up under pressure. Like, what if the KGB agent drops a tab of acid in your drink? You've got to be ready for it. It was pretty weird, the ex-Marine explained. I'm 18 and chasing all the whores in town, and these CIA guys are buying my drinks and paying for the whores and giving me a whole lot of drinks with lots of weird drugs in them. One of the drugs was LSD. Pretty soon all the shadows are moving around. We're in this bar. Seeing samurais are everywhere, and I started to see skeletons and things. My mind just started boiling over, going about 1,000 miles a minute. In addition to LSD, the Atsugi-based Marine was given mescaline, sodium pentothal, downers, and speed. I'm sure there are going to be some little old ladies who are going to be surprised that illegal drugs like heroin and LSD were freely used by government agents, he continued. But that's the way it was. If that's the way it was, it's important to mention that Atsugi was the home, during those years, of another young Marine, Lee Harvey Oswald. In fact, Oswald served in the same Marine unit as the source. Private Lee Harvey Oswald arrived in Atsugi in September 1957. He was 17 years old and had spent his childhood bouncing between foster homes and the company of his widowed mother in New York, Louisiana, and Texas. A voracious reader who scored above average on aptitude tests, he had nonetheless been habitually truant and dropped out of high school. This led him into the Marines and to Japan, ostensibly as a radar operator. According to CIA officials, however, Oswald attracted the attention of the Tokyo CIA station and was recruited for its special operations. According to James Walcott, a CIA finance officer in Japan at the time of the Kennedy assassination, news of the events in Dallas came as no great shock to agency personnel. First, they had expected someone to do something about Kennedy and his anti-CIA policies. And second, the man who appeared to have taken the task upon himself, Lee Harvey Oswald, was no stranger to the CIA. The story that circulated among CIA personnel stationed in Tokyo, Walcott maintains, was that Oswald had been recruited from the Marines for a deep cover operation into the USSR. With no friends in the Marines, fleeting contact with his family, and a history of moving about, he would easily have been able to embark on a secret project without attracting much attention. The most striking aspect of Walcott's statement was that he'd heard speculation that the CIA's recruitment of Oswald at Atsugi was facilitated by a special handle the agency had on Oswald. After discovering during a routine lie detector test that he'd murdered someone or committed some other serious crime. A routine test, or one assisted by modern chemistry. The HSCA rejected Walcott's story of Oswald's CIA recruitment for lack of corroboration from other Tokyo-based agents, instigating Investigating covert matters 2 years after the fact is not easy, due in part to faulty memories, some intentionally faulty. As former CIA Director Richard Helms stated when asked to explain gaps in his testimony on the JFK assassination, quote, "My memory has been contaminated," unquote. Thus, any direct trail from the CIA to Oswald remains, as one might expect, clouded. Oswald's career as a Marine was, in a word, weird. At one point, he shot himself, wounding his arm in what appeared to be a feeble suicide attempt rather than the accident he claimed it was. His fellow Marines saw it as a ploy to enable him to remain in Japan when his unit was to be transferred. The official record says that he was shot with his .48 caliber service revolver, but it was later ruled that he had been shot with a .22. On another occasion, while Oswald was on guard duty, gunfire was heard. He was found sitting on the ground, more than a little dazed, babbling about seeing things in the bushes. His colleagues, unfamiliar with what in the 60s would later be known as a bad trip, walked him back to his barracks and put him to bed. Somehow, between shooting himself and shooting randomly into the bushes, Oswald learned to speak Russian. Walcott and others contend that these language lessons were courtesy of the CIA. In parentheses, Private Oswald possessed a high security clearance, end of parentheses. No one has suggested any other way he could have achieved the proficiency he did, but Oswaldkovich, as he was dubbed by his befuddled barracks mates, was then prepared for the next step on what turned out to be a rather strange trip. In September 1959, he requested and received an early discharge from the Marines, and then traveled, with unexplained money and by unknown means, to the Soviet Union. There he swiftly appeared at the U.S. Embassy to announce he was defecting and giving military secrets to the Russians. The change from Marine to Muscovite was sudden and dramatic, leaving almost everyone puzzled. One exception was Oswald's mother, Marguerite, who showed herself to be a woman ahead of the times by contending in 1960 that her son was a spy for the U.S. government. Her argument was so compelling that J. Edgar Hoover sent out a memo 2.5 years before the assassination suggesting there was more to Oswald than met the eye. If Oswald was sent to Russia as a pseudo-defector, performing some covert task for the U.S., in parentheses, exactly what the Russians expected from the beginning, end of parentheses, then it's quite possible he was given LSD as part of his training. A lengthy CIA memo entitled Truth, Drugs in Interrogation reveals the agency's predilection for administering LSD to agents who were destined for dangerous overseas missions. The CIA feared that the Russians might use LSD in interrogations or as a brainwashing device. An adversary intelligence service, in the words of the report, could employ LSD to produce anxiety or terror in medically unsophisticated subjects, unable to distinguish drug-induced psychosis from actual insanity. But as the report states, an enlightened operative, that is, someone who had tripped before and was therefore familiar with LSD's effects, would not freak out, knowing that the effects of these hallucinogenic agents is transient in normal individuals. The question is, was Oswald enlightened? Life for Oswald in Russia was almost as strange as life in the Marines. He traveled to obscure places doing mundane tasks. Biographers still wonder what he was really up to. When the Russians told Oswald they were returning him to the U.S., he tried to slit his wrists, another unsuccessful suicide. As in the Marines, he was allowed to stay. In Minsk, where he was given work in a radio factory, he met and fell in love with an attractive 19-year-old who, ironically, was a druggist. Her name was Marina Prusakova, and she lived with her uncle, a Soviet intelligence officer. Their courtship lasted but a month, but most of it while Oswald was in a hospital and under medication, allegedly recovering from an adenoid operation. They were married, and Oswald inexplicably soon began making arrangements to return with his bride to America. The Warren Commission briefly considered the possibility that Oswald had been brainwashed by Soviet secret police prior to his return to the U.S. The Commission was suspicious about the suicide attempt and hypothesized that Oswald might have been tampered with while hospitalized in Moscow. At one point, the Commission asked the CIA for a briefing on the latest developments in mind control. Richard Helms, then head of CIA covert operations, concluded that while the Soviets were studying drugs like LSD for possible clandestine use, there was no evidence Oswald had been brainwashed. Helms wrote in a June 1964 memo, "Soviet research in pharmacological agents producing behavioral effects has consistently lagged 5 years behind Western research. There is no present evidence that the Soviets have any singular new potent drugs, or that they are particularly expert in the use of such drugs to force a course of action on an individual." In parentheses, later that same year, Helms privately urged that the CIA continue to test LSD and related chemicals on unwitting American citizens in order to keep up, quote, with Soviet advances in this field, unquote, end parentheses. While Oswald was in Russia falling in love with a pharmacist, the CIA was bedding down with mobsters in an effort to bump off Fidel Castro. Both longed for a return to the Cuba that had existed before Fidel, a right-wing haven for gamblers, drug runners, and the United Fruit Company. The CIA's anti-Cuban alliance with the Mafia was originally supervised by then CIA Director Allen Dulles, who later sat on the Warren Commission but failed to inform the other commissioners of the CIA's assassination plots. Thus, the Commission never considered the implications of what Lyndon Johnson called the CIA's Murder Incorporated in the Caribbean. The CIA's anti-Castro operations began before Kennedy took office with a series of foiled attempts to undermine Fidel's charismatic appeal. One plan was to spray Castro's broadcasting studio with a powerful hallucinogen similar to LSD, creating an embarrassing scene as the premier babbled in a drug-induced stupor. This plan was scrapped because the drug proved too unpredictable. Yet another plot involved dusting Castro's shoes with thallium salts, which would cause his beard to fall out, apparently hatched at the CIA's Bible desk. Operation Samson postulated that Castro would lose his charisma once defrocked of hair. A few months of pursuing such dubious schemes, the CIA shifted its focus from bad trips and beard trims to eliminating Castro altogether. In August 1960, Colonel Sheffield Edwards, who had originally conducted Project Artichoke for the CIA, was asked to organize an assassination squad to snuff out Castro. Edwards turned to the CIA's Las Vegas contacts, eventually hiring mobsters Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and Santos Travacante for the task. Here's a side note. It was just those same mobsters whose networks the heroin that the CIA helped to process out of Marseille, France, as they were in cahoots with the Corsican Mafia, who also are implicated somehow in the Kennedy assassination. Back to the article. Colonel Edwards' successor in charge of the Castro project, William Harvey, was another CIA spook who graduated from mind control to murder conspiracies. Harvey was one of a handful of CIA officers kept abreast of behavior control projects from the beginning, and as CIA chief in West Germany in the 1950s, he employed LSD in special interrogations. He was then promoted to head Operation ZR-Rifle, which developed the CIA's, quote, executive action capability, end quote, a euphemism for the agency's capability to assassinate foreign leaders. Harvey, along with MKUltra's head sorcerer-scientist, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, studied the feasibility of applying a bizarre array of gadgets and biochemical poisons to executive actions. This program banded together the most right-wing elements of the CIA with their natural allies, anti-Castro mercenaries, and the mob. Such an unholy alliance was not officially acknowledged until the 1975 Senate investigation headed by Senator Frank Church, which established that there had been 8 attempts on Castro's life. Parentheses, Castro, in a better position to count, numbered them at closer to 80. End parentheses. Senator Church reported that the plots utilized deadly bacterial powders, cigars dipped in lethal poison, exploding seashells, a poison fountain pen rigged with a hypodermic syringe, and other devices that strain the imagination. The CIA even considered the possibility of using a hypnotized Manchurian candidate to kill Castro. In attempting to unravel these murder schemes, Church's Senate Select Committee on Intelligence found itself over a barrel when Johnny Roselli's body turned up inside one, floating in the ocean. He was one of several participants in the CIA Mafia plots who met an untimely death. Before he was murdered in 1976, Roselli claimed that Oswald had been a mere patsy, and that the real presidential assassins had been a Mafia hit squad originally trained to kill Castro. And what was the motive? CIA rightists were apparently incensed by JFK, who in his last year had obstructed anti-Castro paramilitary operations while making moves toward détente with Cuba. The House Assassinations Committee also suggested that the JFK conspirators were organized crime figures, presumably Traficante and others involved with CIA attempts on Castro. It was against this backdrop of secret plots and CIA Mafia connivance that Oswald returned to America in June 1962. During his years abroad, the drug expertise and enthusiasm of the CIA had advanced to the point where various chemicals, including LSD, were routinely used in questioning defectors, suspected double agents, and the like. The returning Oswald seemed a prime candidate for special interrogation, given the circumstances of his defection and the suddenness of his return. Yet there is no evidence that the CIA or any other agency met with Oswald upon his arrival. Parentheses, the State Department even loaned him $435 for his return to the U.S. End parentheses. Just a side note, before the CIA base in Atsugi, Japan, in the Far East, there was the OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination, was a precursor to the CIA, later incorporated into the CIA, but it was actually a State Department office that ran a lot of shady organizations in Eastern Europe and in the Far East. So the State Department also had something to protect with the demise of President Kennedy, who was onto the trail of what was going on in the early 50s after the war. See Cord Meyer Jr., who was a member of the OPC at the time. Back to the article. Oswald's life in America was no less peculiar than it had been in Atsugi or in Minsk. Lee and Marina settled in Texas and soon took up with an odd assortment of friends, none more unusual than George de Mohrenschildt, born a Russian count before the Revolution. De Mohrenschildt thrived in a world of political shadows, appearing at various times to be working for Polish intelligence, the Nazis, the French resistance, the British, the Americans, the Rockefellers, a man of many masks. By 1962, he was calling himself a geologist and a friend to the Oswalds. Side note, George de Mohrenschildt, actually von Mohrenschildt, he was not a Russian, he was a white Russian, or Belarusian, and it was the Belarusian Nazi collaborators that were the Eastern European friends of the OPC in the early 50s. The OPC used these vicious Nazi collaborators who were responsible for the murder of tens of thousands of Jews and Nazi enemies. They were later many of them were brought into the United States. The OPC was in charge of whitewashing their history so that they can gain entry back into the United States, where they lived their lives peaceably and never had to face the sword of justice. This is another thing that was completely secret at the time of JFK's assassination. Part of the scenario was Reinhard Gillen, and de Mohrenschildt was actually associated with Gillen in the early 50s or late 40s. Back to the article. In April 1963, Oswald moved to New Orleans, where his social circle, in view of his alleged Marxist sympathies, was even stranger than in Dallas. There he met Carlos Bringuier, an anti-Castro Cuban exile with CIA connections. Oswald first sought to work with Bringuier, then appeared to be working against him. Eventually, the two engaged in a well-publicized street brawl and then a debate about Cuba on New Orleans radio. Joining Oswald and Bringuier in the debate was Ed Butler, a right-wing propagandist for the Information Council of the Americas, the INCA, a group that later sold LPs of the debate as part of its anti-communist crusade. The president of the INCA was Alton Ochsner, described as a consultant to the Air Force on the medical side of subversive matters. The directorships of Bringuier's anti-Castro group and Ochsner's INCA included the owners of the Riley Coffee Company, where Oswald, the man being denounced by both organizations as a communist, had recently been on the payroll. By far the strangest bird to intersect Oswald's orbit was David Ferry. Eccentric in behavior, belief, and appearance, Ferry had been an Eastern Airlines pilot until he was arrested for a crime against nature with a 16-year-old boy. He was a priest in the Orthodox Old Catholic Church, a bizarre sect engaging in animal sacrifice and occult rituals. Ferry had no hair on his body, perhaps someone had poisoned his shoes, and wore ill-fitting wigs and fake eyebrows that fooled no one and made a striking, if not shocking, impression on all who saw him. Although the Oswald-Ferry relationship is well proved, it is unclear when it began. The House Assassinations Committee suggested that the two men may have met as early as 1956 in New Orleans, when young Lee was a cadet in the Civil Air Patrol Squadron headed by Ferry. By the time of the 1963 radio debate, Oswald and Ferry were well acquainted. A right-winger who hated Kennedy, Ferry was active in paramilitary operations against Castro and claimed to have flown in the CIA-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Ferry was also a hypnotist and fancied himself a biochemist. He claimed to have created drugs that caused cancer, or, in parentheses, something that the CIA was also secretly developing, end quote, or in parentheses, I'm sorry, or caused heart attacks indistinguishable from natural death, parentheses, another CIA endeavor, in parentheses, as well as aphrodisiacs and amnesia-inducing drugs. At times, his apartment was overrun by laboratory mice. Many attributed his hairless condition to a chemistry experiment gone awry. On top of all his strange hobbies, Ferry worked as a pilot and private investigator for Carlos Marcello, the Mafia boss of New Orleans and Dallas, and sworn enemy of the Kennedys, a cohort of the CIA Mafia conspirators, and, according to his tax returns, one heck of a tomato salesman. Marcello claimed a $1,600 per month income from tomato sales, but somehow had accumulated a net worth of $40 million, in parentheses, government investigators contend through drugs and racketeering, end parentheses. Side note, most likely it was the result of his participation in the heroin, the Southeast Asian heroin that was being processed in Marseille, France, and coming over with the help of the CIA to the United States of America. Back to the article. Thus, David Ferry represents a nexus in the JFK murder mystery between the Mafia and the CIA, drugs, and assassination. In 1967, his ranking as premier oddball in the case was assured when he died of an apparent suicide, soon after having become a key suspect in the assassination probe led by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. Into this bed of strange fellows crawled Lee Harvey Oswald in the summer of 1963. What kept him going through those days is not exactly clear. His jobs were meager and his political efforts half-hearted. The best explanation for his political schizophrenia is that Oswald was some type of informant posing as a pro-Castroite. His marriage was less than ideal, and Marina was beginning to see him as a bit of a space cadet. Quote, Lee no like Russia, end quote, she once said. Quote, Lee no like America, Lee like moon, end quote. Which brings us full circle to what began as a typical day for the New Orleans Assistant DA, Edward Gillen, but ended somewhere in the twilight zone with a strange visit from a young man preaching the virtues of psychedelic drugs. Gillen's assurance that Oswald had been his visitor was rejected by the FBI on the grounds that Gillen was extremely nearsighted and therefore incapable of eyewitness identification. But due to his poor vision, he had come more and more to rely on voice as a means of identification. And when Oswald's voice was played on the radio, the INCA recording previously mentioned, Gillen recognized it as that of his visitor. He claimed that his visitor repeatedly referred to an author whose books on drugs described the new world that the visitor too had foreseen. The FBI, in a case of literary myopia, recorded the author's name as Huxley. Huxley can, of course, be none other than Aldous Huxley, author of The Doors of Perception, the Manifesto of Psychedelics Consciousness. Apparently, he was unknown to the FBI, which is not too surprising. Parentheses, when informed in 1964 that John Paul Sartre had called for a new investigation of the Kennedy assassination, J. Edgar Hoover promptly scribbled on a memo, "Find out who Sartre is," end parentheses. In a slip almost too Freudian to be believed, the FBI's memos refer to Brave New World, Huxley's pessimistic novel of a drug-induced totalitarian society, as this great world. Given Gillen's inability to eyeball Oswald and the FBI's blindness as to who Huxley was, it is not surprising that the Bureau's probe was inconclusive. However, had the FBI taken the trouble to review its own records, it would have found that during the summer of 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald checked out several books by Aldous Huxley from the New Orleans Public Library. Edward Gillen, who is now a juvenile court judge in New Orleans, remembers the conversation as if it had occurred last month. Quote, he was looking for a drug that would open his vision, mind expansion, recalls Gillen. I was very curious about any guy who would come into the DA's office asking if a drug is legal and giving me a long spiel about a book by Aldous Huxley, end quote. In September 1963, Oswald applied for a visa to go to Mexico. Like an odd familiar ghost, the CIA cast another shadow across his path. The visa immediately preceding Oswald's was issued to William Gaudet, an admitted CIA contact. In parentheses, at this time, Gaudet was employed by Dr. Alden Ochsner, the aforementioned INCA president, end parentheses. When the Mexican government submitted the names of visa holders preceding and following Oswald's to the Warrant Commissioner, only the name Gaudet's was omitted. No explanation for the omission has ever been offered. Why did Oswald want to go to Mexico? Having received no help from the New Orleans DA's office, perhaps he was heading south of the border for his quest for drugs. George de Mohrenschildt had traveled frequently to Mexico, and his stories may have figured into Oswald's plans. Parentheses, de Mohrenschildt committed suicide in 1977, shortly before he was to testify before the House Assassinations Committee. End parentheses. Visa in hand, Oswald went to the library to pick up more books by Huxley and a few by Ian Fleming, and soon he was on the long bus ride to Mexico City. What Oswald did there the last week in September has never been totally clear. It's alleged he contacted the Soviet or Cuban embassies. It's reported he hung out on college campuses and attended a party with people connected to early LSD experiments. But Oswald's trail is far too cold to determine just what he was thinking. Perhaps the books he was reading are the best clues to what his trip was about: espionage and mind expansion. In any event, he soon returned to the U.S., to Dallas, and to his place in history. Side note, Mexico was the center of activity for the magic mushrooms that were being discovered and talked about in the late 50s by the Huxley crowd. On November 22nd, 1963, The Kennedy administration came to an abrupt end. On that very day, a cancer-stricken Aldous Huxley lay on his deathbed, took a sizable dose of LSD, and passed on, dripping. Still, the question remains, did Lee Harvey Oswald drop acid? The Assistant DA of New Orleans suggests yes. The FBI says no. By 1963, Oswald had had several opportunities to acquaint himself with psychedelics through the CIA at Atsugi or through his contacts with intelligence and underworld types. Indeed, one could argue that Oswald's life had been a psychedelic minefield, almost impossible to pass through without tripping. His alleged murder of the president, on the other hand, was a shot through the trees at a moving target, a feat that has never been duplicated. Had Oswald lived to tell his story, we could have learned if he had really done either. But such was not his fate, as a stunned TV audience witnessed Oswald's execution at the hands of a gangster. Side note, Oswald did mention that he was just a patsy, so we we may know the story. Back to the article. Years later, when an entire generation of young people seemed to be turning on, George de Mohrenschildt eulogized his friend. Quote, "No matter what they say, Lee Harvey Oswald was a delightful guy. They make him out to be a moron, but he was smart as hell. Ahead of his time, really. A kind of hippie of those days, and I will tell you this, I am sure he did not shoot the president." End quote. Martin A. Lee is completing a book, The CIA and the Acid Generation, The Secret History of LSD. Robert Ramphtel was an investigator and storyteller in Berkeley, California. Jeff Cohen is a lawyer and writer in Los Angeles. All three authors were associated with the Assassination Information Bureau. Side note, I actually have the original magazine article. I had ordered it many years ago, and I had copied it verbatim. The article can be found on one of my blogs, and I will put the link in the section below.